we center ourselves around people, center ourselves around liberation, and we take back the narrative that we can't do this, we're too young, that it's too late. It's never too late to build power. It's never too late to engage with your community. It's never too late to tell your truth and tell your story about your experience with the climate crisis, your experience with the fossil fuel industry.
Listening to A Climate Change. This is Matern, your host. I've got a great guest on the show, Amelia Southern-Uribe. Amelia works for a number of different organizations. They're the climate justice strategist, a youth-led movement leader, and director of global organizing at 0 Hour, as well as co-founder and editor-in-chief of Roots magazine. So as a nationally recognized climate justice strategist and communication leader, Amelia works at the intersection of environmental justice, narrative power, and youth-led policy based in the American South in Arkansas. And they're committed to uplifting frontline communities and who are often left out of national climate conversations, particularly the BIPOC communities. And their work is grounded in the belief that effective storytelling is essential to both organizing and policy change. Welcome to the program, Amelia.
Thank you for having me, Matt.
So tell us a little bit about your journey. I always like to start at the beginning. And what were the things that led you into the climate movement and being environmentally aware and wanting to focus your passion and work on this area?
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up in the American South, and that for me held a number of responsibilities and shaped a lot of my beliefs. But when I was about 6 or 7 years old, I was living in South Florida, and the Deepwater Horizon oil spill had just erupted. And I had seen through not only the news, but in the local community, the impact that oil spill had. And particularly for me, coming from a Colombian American background, living in a predominantly Latino and immigrant community, it became very clear to me without actually knowing what environmental injustice was, that that's what was happening. And as I moved through life with hurricanes and oil spills and corporate extraction, I noticed that there was a pattern. And ultimately, when I ended up moving to Arkansas when I was about 12 years old, I noticed the same thing was happening in another predominantly immigrant community where I was living in Arkansas. But this time it was due to industrial agriculture. And I used to live in this area that was tainting the water. It was tainting the air. And the people that were working in this factory meatpacking plant were under horrible labor conditions. And ultimately, one of my close friends, their sister lost lung function because of this corporation. And so growing up in South Florida and then moving to Arkansas, I had noticed that environmental justice is so central to this work. When we talk about climate change, when we talk about, working towards a sustainable future, we have to lead with frontline communities. And living in areas that were on the front lines for all of my life in an area that had been so neglected, I wanted to do something. So I found an organization that prioritized environmental justice and youth leaders, 0 Hour. And I didn't want to just take my anxiety, my pain, and my frustration with the lack of inaction. I wanted to do something with that. So when I was 16, I founded a chapter in Arkansas. And over the course of 6 years, I dedicated all of my time to building and training the next generation of leaders in climate in Fayetteville, Arkansas, to do something about what was going on in our community.
That's a great story. Thank you for sharing that. I do think that sometimes it is kind of lost, in the news cycle that real people are affected by this pollution, and that we've got this kind of pollution blanket that covers the planet, quite frankly. Speaking to this NASA scientist, he said if some alien civilization were to come and look at the Earth at some point in time, what they find is a layer of plastic on the bottom of the ocean, for example. So we've just littered the entire planet with garbage and chemicals, and we just it's unfortunate. And like you said, poor communities tend to bear the brunt of this because those industrial facilities are built closer to these poor communities, and they're spewing their waste products right out into the air. And young kids are the ones that are most adversely affected in their young lungs and all that. And you see it here in Los Angeles that high rates of asthma and stuff like that because of all this pollution. So great work in addressing that. Tell us a little bit about the things that you've done on the ground there in Fayetteville or the surrounding area, and how that's moved the needle.
Yeah, absolutely. So, organizing in Fayetteville, I didn't really have a model of what it meant to build power. There's lack of unions. There's a lack of visible and present activism. And at the same time, we were up against these big corporations. It's a big daunting thing to think that I was 16 years old, wanting to take on the corporations literally that own the grocery stores that I was shopping at, the chicken that I was eating, and also tainting the water. So I knew that I had to build power. I wasn't sure how I was going to do it in an area that is outwardly, less progressive, very, very like suburban communities. I didn't have the same access to resources like they do in bigger cities with people mobilizing. So I wanted to get young people involved in a way that felt fun. And what we did for the past 6 years is we combined so many different tactics and strategies to, provide an entry point for people. We threw parties. We created a youth and student-made zine, and we distributed it across Arkansas. But at the same time, we knew that we couldn't just have fun. We had to have a structured campaign that had escalation arcs of and timelines, and our ability to take on, the environmental injustice in our community relied on us being effective, but also building a narrative that people felt related to, not the narrative that we had seen so much, or that I had seen so much, that environmental justice work is for people with privilege. This work is for people that don't always are grounded in other issues, right? And why I'm bringing this up is because a lot of my community members wanted to address racial justice. They wanted to address economic justice. They were working 3 jobs. They had families to provide for. So we needed to create an intergenerational movement. And we did that through building a movement that centered our experiences. And we knew that what worked in Arkansas wouldn't work in California, and vice versa. So our big accomplishments over the last 6 years is I started out with a team of 3 people. And by the time that I left the organization, we had impacted over 19,000 people in Arkansas. We had mobilized people to protest. We threw fundraisers. And what we really wanted to do, though, is leave with a sense of visibility. In preserving and disseminating information through our zines, we were able to document the harm in our community. We were able to address corporations and distribute this information that we had all felt, but we had never seen in paper because it felt too risky, too difficult to have the conversations of what these corporations were doing out loud, because they fund. Yeah, like I've said before, they funded my school, they funded, and they owned the grocery stores that we shop at. It was so central to our lived experience that we needed to find a way to get creative. But yeah, so 6 years in Arkansas, we built this massive mobilization of affected over 19,000 people, and that was through a lot of structured based organizing.
That's great. I like the term that you used. I've never heard it before. Escalation arcs. So, I think that's an interesting term, and I think if we can build a movement that is kind of escalating, it has a good arc. There has been a kind of curveball that has been thrown into the escalation arc by the current administration, and I guess I'd like to know from you what are
Yeah,
your thoughts in dealing with what is now a radically changed environmental agenda from the current administration as opposed to the prior U.S. executive administration?
absolutely. Well, I will say that a lot of the stuff that we're dealing with now, deregulation, increased deportation, increased presence of factors that make our work in the environment harder, not just because of policy changes, but of like lack of federal funding. These are challenges that we were already facing, but now they're amplified. And I want to say that, especially being an organizer from the American South, where they tested out these policies, where they tested out deregulation, where they tested out increasing authoritarianism, we have to look to areas that have been affected. We have to look to organizers in the red states. We have to look to organizers in southern states that have already felt this repression before. And it is harder to organize under these conditions of not having the same financial resources, not having the same federal visible support. But the work still needs to continue. And I know that at Zero Hour, we're changing our work to be less federal focused because we know that we can't push the same legislation that we were able to a year ago. We aren't able to have the same relationships with the administration. But we do know that the one thing that hasn't changed is the power and ability of local organizers to make change in their community. And when we focus less on what we can achieve federally and more what we can do on a local level, I think we could actually see global effects of that. So one way that we're changing is we're training young people in California to stop stop fossil fuel subsidies. And we know that that's possible in an area where California is the fourth largest economy in the world. And according to a institute study, we have found that 50 to 60% of new fossil fuel projects would not be economically viable without fossil fuel subsidies. So there's ways that we can implement change. We just have to get creative. We have to look to organizers that have had this experience before, but also empower communities that relied on, or organizations that relied on federal change, federal funding, to consolidate our power and find community with each other, to collaborate better as organizations, to find that we don't have the same privileges that we did a year ago of being able to work in silos. We really need, as organizations, as movement leaders, as people that care about our future on this planet, to work together and find new creative ways to empower local communities, but also to share resources, to strategize together, and to go back to that word, the escalation arc, to escalate the fight strategically, but not alone.
Well, I like the part that you mentioned about doing hyperlocal projects, because I do think that in the last time Trump was in power and as a president, a lot of states and local governments did a lot of great work because they now knew, hey, the federal government is not going to do anything. So it's on us. We've got to do it on the local level. And some amazing work got done. And so kudos to you for the work in California to stop fossil fuel subsidies. And, the Republicans are always saying, or Trump is always saying, hey, we're subsidizing wind and solar. But he never talks about the subsidies for coal and natural gas and oil, which are huge. I mean, they're tremendously large. So one of the things that I've read about recently, and I think makes some sense, is kind of populism based upon, environmental justice and in terms of how it affects working class people, and really shifting the narrative to how these policies affect working class people. And one of the things that you talked about was the water being tainted from factories that are polluting. And that's a message that's got to resonate with basically everybody. That was the beginnings of the environmental movement here in the US.
Yeah.
Was like one of the rivers up in the Northeast actually lighting on fire. There was so much toxic stuff in the water. So maybe talk about that and what change you've helped affect in that area of Arkansas with the water.
Yeah, absolutely. So I do think it's a relatable thing. And I think that the fight for clean air, clean water, and healthy children is something that resonates with everyone. Especially, being in an area that is less progressive, and knowing that like the struggle in Fayetteville or Springdale or Northwest Arkansas is not unique to Arkansas. It was hard to enact change when corporations own and take ownership of a lot of the good that they bring to the community, but don't acknowledge the bad. But the work that we've done in Arkansas relied on the ability for us to be trained and to have these conversations with community members that don't even know what environmental injustice is, that they don't understand even that the water shouldn't be like this, that the air shouldn't be like this. But so it really became down to relationship building. If we could gain the community's trust and instead not just engage them, we took our ownership of being community-led, community-founded, and solving the community's issues by the people that were most affected by it. But it required us to build coalition with partners outside of Arkansas. So we took this strategy of working on policy with the Arkansas Environmental Policy Board, because we knew that water was an issue across Arkansas. And it actually is even worse the more south that you go in Arkansas. There's communities of predominantly Black communities in South Arkansas and East Arkansas that didn't have running water for 8 months. And it was so tainted, not just by, for us, it was industrial farming, but in other places, it's been lithium mining. And so we knew that we needed to work together and strategically, but our niche was mobilizing young people. So we built out a campaign where we polled over 300 members of our community, asked them what they wanted to see change. And we are now in the process, and now I'm advising the group that I founded. So I'm still involved with them, making sure that they are not only just holding these corporations accountable, not just testing and doing research on the water, but even more so figuring out a strategic parts of how to mobilize members that didn't even think that they cared about environmental injustice or that they knew what that was, right? So the work that we've done to stop this pollution, to stop corporations extracting our land, our people, and our labor is a much larger fight. And when we zoom out, it needs to be addressed in several other parts. So this campaign has been focusing on not just corporate accountability, but university accountability. We're taking on a housing crisis. We're taking on an environmental injustice crisis, but also a labor crisis. We started working with a labor union group for one of the corporations in Springdale that is predominantly immigrant-led. And we found ways to not only support our work but to support theirs, because we knew that we needed to have people inside that had information. But also we found ways to protect the workers. And it's unfortunate, to say the least, the harm that is not just on the land or in our water or in our air, but we can't separate what this does to the people. And that's where our zine came in. We found ways to not only just disseminate the information that people, when you grow up in these areas, you think that it's normal. You think that it's normal to experience injustice. You think that it's a part of your life. I know I had a unique experience coming from Florida to Arkansas. But for people that had been socialized to just accept the harm, accept this extraction and pain in multiple ways, physical, emotional, spiritual pain. We needed to address that too. So we actually started providing climate anxiety sessions to have spaces where people could talk about what was going on in the community, to talk about these feelings of grief, of loss. And over the course of 6 years, we did a lot to not just address the root of the problem, but to also address the symptoms. And that's where we are now, and building out and escalating this campaign of, we've disseminated zines about not just the harm, but about the corporations, about the stories that aren't being told from young people, and intergenerational knowledge of the stories of our land, of the stories of our communities. But more so, we want to communicate to people outside of Arkansas that just because this is happening in one part or multiple hubs of the state, our pain and the struggle and the fight for liberation from this is so connected to other people. It's connected to people outside of Arkansas. And our story is one of thousands across the nation. There's so many towns across the US and globally that are struggling to fight for their liberation because corporations own land, water, food, and they're the ones that provide their income. So I say all of that to say that we knew that to make a difference, we had to train people. We had to document the harm. We had to disseminate the information, but we also had to mobilize people in a way that had not been attempted before, and to make activism feel welcoming.
Well, it's a big job, and there's a lot of facets to it, and it's and at its best, it's organic, and it kind of grows out of people's concern, and obviously you got to help that along when people are busy with their lives. As you were talking, one of the things that came to mind is kind of like the slow poisoning that takes place in communities with living around factories or places that pollute a lot. And it's just kind of little bit by little bit by little bit, sending out poison into the community. And there is a sense of helplessness that, I don't know where to start. I don't know how to stop this. And I know that I certainly have driven by industrial facilities here in Los Angeles and feel the same way. Like, geez, how do you stop this from occurring? It's a big effort. So, kudos to you for working on that. And empowering people to say, yes, we can do something. Yes, let's start doing something together. We have a voice. And maybe you can tell us about some of the victories in terms of, have you gotten people to listen on the ground? Have you gotten corporations to change their behavior? Have you gotten local communities to stand up for their citizens and say, hey, we're mad as hell and we're not going to take it anymore?
Yeah, absolutely. So it makes me think about, first that it is a long fight, right? And there's small and big wins across this fight. But in the last year, especially, I think that we faced more repression. I'm thinking of the now co-president and my friend Helena, who led this huge fight to protect some land near us. And it was a really rapid response campaign where we were, protecting land that was going to be destroyed and bulldozed by the city. And it related to our, a work of conservation, in the sense that like this was a community space and we wanted to protect it. Ultimately, the trees were cut down, the land was destroyed, but the real win is that we found consistent ways to bring the community together around art, around music, around land. And we ended up having a lot of conversations with city council. Helena was at city council every Tuesday, building trust with the members of city council. And now we have built our relationships with local leaders to have them know us by name, have us like at meetings and talk to us. And they became some of our biggest allies, even though it was a huge loss that the community, space was destroyed. We actually were able to build something with the leaders of our town, to advance this campaign. So while we haven't been able to change, corporations' labor practices or, hold them accountable for tainting our air and our water, what we have been able to do is find ways to strategically not just, again, mobilize people around these spaces, but build relationships out of them. And so now as we move into our second phase of the campaign, they've even helped some of our leaders at the Arkansas chapter sponsor resolutions and have them speak and invite them to hold town halls about housing and about just climate justice. And I guess the win is that in the most unexpected places, you can find solidarity, even though they tore down the area. They were also resisting, right? It's not just like one or two people that vote for something like that to happen, but we did find and strengthen relationships with the city council members that were also advocating for the resistance of land destruction. So other wins, though, that feel more tangible and real is that we raised over $10,000 for environmental education work and organizing work because we became the place where young people would go to find their political and movement home. And housing so many young people, training so many young people, and providing them with this space to not only find their community and to make a difference in the community, we were able to mobilize so many people because we became so structured, we became so self-sufficient and finding resources and creating allies like how we did with the city council members. But as we found, our political home and our movement home, we diverted over 200,000 pounds of waste because we began to engage in mutual aid work, where we would give young women free menstrual cups on campus. So we were meeting this need of in the community, saving them hundreds of dollars, but also finding unique ways to save the planet through sustainability. And so these like little small things that feel so intangible and, obscure, these relationships or finding and building spaces for young people, to raising money and to distributing resources across the community, we found that the real win is how we're supporting each other and how we are, up against this giant and multiple giants of corporations and companies. But the win had always been that we can build people power. And the people power is what will sustain the movement so that we can win those wins of changing labor practice and changing ways to hold the corporations accountable, and finding ways to not invest in the corporations, but invest in the community.
Well, that's a great message. I believe this is a marathon and not a sprint. So trying to get long-term wins versus focusing so much on the short-term stuff. Obviously, the short-term stuff is important. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it, but building an organization, building relationships, and building trust with the community, and maybe you don't get that first win, but maybe down the road you affect some positive change. Maybe you compromise, and it's not a full win, but it's not as bad of a loss. So, you're constantly improving and maybe reaching some people. Like you said, you're reaching people by showing up, being human, being caring, being compassionate. Those kinds of things communicate, and they change minds a lot more effectively than almost anything else. So that's great work to just keep showing up, keep engaging, and doing it with intelligence and kindness and compassion and good arguments. And sooner or later, those things will win the day. But we've got to keep showing up to do those things. And I guess the other part of it that I resonated with was do something now, and that's one of the themes of this show, is to encourage people to do something today. And along those lines, I'd love to hear your thoughts as to what your encouragements are as to what listeners can do today. And it may be small. You mentioned some things that are modest things, but they're movements in the right direction. And I think it's a shift in consciousness when we start taking those movements, even if they are modest.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a beautiful question. And I think that's what keeps us engaged with the work too, is like, what can we do to not only ground ourselves in the movement, but to keep ourselves going? I think that I would ask the listeners to educate yourself on environmental injustice fights that are happening across the country, and not just in your community, but finding ways to get involved in your community, right? If you're organizing, I want to ask you, are you organizing with frontliners? Are you organizing with communities? And maybe you live in a frontline community, right? Like, the biggest thing that we can do to work on this giant fight, this global fight, is to find local solutions and to lead them. And I think the one thing that we can do that doesn't feel so overwhelming is to lead with love. And I say that all the time because I think that truly this work is exhausting. And if we remember our why, our ultimate goal, our shared goal of a clean and sustainable future, lead with that. Lead with the intention of making an impact, of showing up with love, of showing up with care, of showing up with the hope, the radical hope and joy that we will celebrate a win. We will celebrate this crisis being over, because if we believe it to be true, if we believe that we can actually take on the giants, if we can take on the corporations, if we can take on the fossil fuels that are making us sick and even leading to death, I think that we can truly fight for something that we believe in. And so I ask those listeners, get involved in your community, find ways to show up for your community outside of organizing, have those hard conversations, engage other people in this work, bring them into it, bring your friends. And also to know that this is a marathon, not a sprint, right? Take time to do the work, but also enjoy it. Throw a party, throw an art show, and celebrate that this work doesn't have to feel so centered around pain, but it instead could be something that bring people together.
So tell us about the role you believe storytelling plays in connecting youth-led activism to concrete policy out.
We are at a critical point of the climate crisis. We're building out new liquefied natural gas terminals that could lock us in to a threshold of passing even 2 degrees Celsius. We need a mobilized fight. We need a mobilized story that we can tell, because it's never just about the story. It's about the people with real life impacts, with real stories of loss, of real stories of pain. And as a movement, we need to honor those stories. We need to honor those truths. And especially, even if we look to the beginning of this year, with wildfires in Los Angeles a year ago, from a couple days ago, there was Hurricane Helene and Milton. So many lives were lost. And we're not telling and embracing these stories enough because they're painful. And they're not platforms, in the same way that I think other stories are. And so when we center ourselves around people, center ourselves around liberation, and we take back the narrative that we can't do this, we're too young, that it's too late. It's never too late to build power. It's never too late to engage with your community. It's never too late to tell your truth and tell your story about your experience with the climate crisis, your experience with the fossil fuel industry. Because the more that we bring this into the main topic of conversation and culture and community spaces, even peer to peer, one conversation can be the difference between someone getting involved and not. And the more that we make this a topic in our arts, in our media, not just the news, but even in the literature that we consume, I think the more we normalize that these experiences are happening across the nation, and we're not just watching them on our phone anymore. We're seeing them outside of our window, and in our community. And we need to be honest about those stories.
Right. Well, I have 3 friends that had their homes burned down in the wildfires here, and many others affected by it, and certainly all of LA County was breathing this horrid smoke that was, somewhat. It was very toxic because it was burned a bunch of cars and batteries and all kinds of plastics and God knows what. So we were all breathing in just terrible air because of these wildfires, which clearly were exacerbated or caused by the increasing temperatures that we have here and across the globe. That we're having these wildfires in Canada that are unprecedented. These types of fires never occurred in recent history, or at least anyone can discern that they've occurred anytime recently. So, these are painful stories to tell, and it's uncomfortable to talk about these things because they are so darn painful. It's easier to kind of avoid them and sweep them under the rug, but they're real stories. And one of my friends is actually 2 of them may not be able to rebuild for various reasons. So there's a lot of economic pain and just people's entire life went up in flames. One friend was an artist; all of her art was burned down. I mean, just it's a loss of epic proportions. So those stories kind of
Absolutely.
need to be told, because otherwise they're just statistics of, oh yeah, X amount of thousands of people had their houses burned down. That can be easy to kind of push off into the back corner of our brains, versus actual humans had this happen to them and it was horrendous.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so sorry about your friends, and I'm sorry that I even have to say sorry. Like, this is the way that we dehumanize humans that have gone through, like, this trauma, this climate and natural disaster trauma. It's heavy. You have to grieve. You have to mourn the loss of not just these, like, tangible things, these items, but what they mean to you, right? It's never just about losing your home or losing the art that you created. It's about what it represents, and it's about that it's hundreds of people that I'm sure share similar stories, and I'm just so sorry. And I think that you're so right. When we tell these stories, we humanize this pain, but we also are able to empathize with people that in a way that statistics can't do. And I think it's important that we center that experience of grief and of pain and of loss, but also acknowledging it and turning that grief and paralyzing grief into knowing that we may not be able to replace the things that were burnt down or the health impacts of natural disasters, but what we can do is tell it, acknowledge it, mourn as a community, and rebuild something outside of this future that we've been told that we have to live. We have to experience natural disasters. We have to experience climate change. But we can tank that, and we can organize around it.
Well, looking ahead, what are the key opportunities for integrating youth voices into the national climate decision making, and how can youth-led organizations kind of lead us out of, or help lead us out of, the current situation we're in right now?
Yeah. I think that historically, when we look at periods of history, youth-led movements have led the way. They have mobilized college campuses. They have been able to enact historic policy change with civil rights to liberation from economic struggles, with the Don't Bail Out Wall Street movement in the 2000s, to playing a huge part in the resistance against the Vietnam War. When we looked at history, I think we can also look to the future. There is so many groups of youth-led climate justice leaders doing incredible things, mobilizing young people in every context in this country. And I would advocate that we can't do it alone as young people. And we need intergenerational support. And I think that's what we're building as a movement right now, as a youth-led climate justice movement. I think that we can build us out of this moment in time when we address issues as intersectional. At 0 Hour, we're building out a program to train young people to train other people in their communities, because we know that site fights are only going to increase with the expansion of fossil fuels, the expansion of industrialized corporations taking over public lands. We know that there is a long and hard fight ahead that we may not even know the true impacts. But I think that young people have this innovation, they have a drive, they have the ability to connect with people, and also the energy and solutions that are just not being tapped into. And I think if you're a young person listening to this, if you're in high school, if you're in college, get involved, because truly, as institutions, universities hold so much power. And when we look to history, when we hold our institutions accountable, we actually hold a larger group of leaders accountable. And as we move through these fights, not just site fights, but the national fight for liberation from not just climate injustice, but injustice as a whole, youth are going to play a huge role in building bases, in building power, and mobilizing people to take on these fights. So the answer is not a pretty one, but we're going to need help. We're going to need support. We're going to need everyone involved in this fight, that it cannot just be youth, but young people right now are mobilizing in ways that I haven't seen happen in a while. And I think it's really beautiful to know that even when we look to the encampments or just recent history of youth coming together and building power, truly anything is possible when we can band together as a community.
Lots of work ahead. Thank you, Amelia, so much for being on the show. Enjoyed having the conversation and really congratulate you on the amazing work that you've done thus far, and look forward to collaborating with you going forward. And please tell our listeners where they can find you, and how can they help you to continue the work that you're doing down there in Arkansas and in other places as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you so much for having me, Matt. It's been a pleasure to talk with you about the work that we're up to. But you can find me on Instagram and the work at This Is Your Hour on Instagram and other social media platforms with the same name. And then you can find my work and what I've been up to at Amelia Southern on Instagram. And we don't need to just tell these stories and acknowledge the truth of what we're up against, but also we need to support and work with youth leaders through this fight. So get involved with us and support us in the way that you can.
Okay. Well, amen to all that. So thank you, everybody, for listening. And yeah, check out Amelia and all of the social channels that you mentioned and the 0 Hour, and continue to support those groups that are doing tremendous work in challenging circumstances. So we all need to get involved. So everybody go out there and do something today. That's the motto.